Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome to Social Enterprise, the Business of Social Work. My name is Daniel. I'm a student representative at ACAP. I'm in the first placement in the Master of Social Work. I'm working with Frank, Field Education Coordinator at ACAP. We will be supporting the session today in the background. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of country throughout Australia, their continued connections to land, sea, and communities. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, extending their respect to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders people today. I encourage you to acknowledge the land you are on in the chat. I'm on Gadigal land. A bit of housekeeping. As the session counts towards placement hours, you'll be taking random attendance throughout the session. Please update your screen name to your full name for attendance purposes. And again, the session is recorded and materials in the recording will be distributed via email after the session. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Please, massive welcome to our presenters, Alice and her amazing team from the Voice of Influence, and Camila, CEO of the Social Outfit. Thank you, presenters, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to hearing about your journey and what you'd like to share with us. Now I invite Alice to introduce yourself, and you can introduce everyone, please. You can go.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Danielle, always for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel again. I know this is the last one of a few that we've done this series, and it's been an absolute pleasure to host them and to continue the conversations on our own learning. I think to start off, actually, we'll pass over to Camila, who is the CEO of the Social Outfit, to tell us a little bit about her story and her introduction, and then we can touch base with the rest of the team who you are already very familiar with. But Camila, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Alice. So I'm Camila. I'm talking to you from Gadigal land. I have the pleasure to lead the Social Outfit, which is a social enterprise. About my background, I am born and raised in Italy with a Swedish mother, and my dream was always to leave Italy and explore the world. I have lived in many, many different countries, but probably the most significant, I spent about 15 years living in New York City, where I worked at the United Nations Secretariat. The last 8 years I was in the office of the Secretary General, and my responsibility was building partnerships. So how do we work with the private sector and their resources to get them to care about the poorest of the poor and think innovation and development. I was then headhunted and decided to leave the organization after 15 years, because we were talking before. I felt that the UN has way too many people that hang on to their jobs forever and needs more young people to really care about the planet and move ahead with change and still believe in it. So I was headhunted to come to Australia and work with a very large philanthropist here and set up his philanthropic work in development and peace. So I headed something called the Institute for Economics and Peace for about 10 years, and we did something called the Global Peace Index. So ranking countries' peacefulness, trying to understand what are the drivers of violence and peace so that we could influence governments to focus on peace. And then what happened? I was about to turn 50, and I thought, I've been in this world of grey suits for way too long, and I've loved working with the super wealthy and business and philanthropists to try and change things, but I've never met the people that I'm trying to help. I've never been with those people, and I wanted a complete change. And so actually on LinkedIn, I saw they were hiring for the CEO of this social enterprise, and I applied almost for fun because I thought, what would I know about this? And you know, within about a month, I was offered the position, and I have never enjoyed anything as much as my role at the Social Outfit. I've been here for 2.5 years now.
Thank you, Camila. I think it's hard not to recognize the irony. You're talking about grey suits and spending too much time in it, and now seeing the color in your background, the color in your earrings and outfits, and I think you can just see like the joy that brings you. So I'm so pleased that you found, you know, your niche, that you're able to connect with the communities that you've been working for so many years, and I'm sure that kind of that connection, that human connection, is so important for the work in the social enterprises. And I think, you know, that's something that the UN needs to do a better job of as well. So I'm so glad that you've been able to see both sides of that. I will pass on. Does Meg or Kelly, do you want to do an introduction? I know the people joining probably are familiar with us, but for the purpose of it, let's do it again.
Yeah. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Meg. I'm joining today from Gadigal country. I'm the Development and Outreach Director for Voices of Influence. I graduated last year with a Bachelor of Social Research and Policy. And my central area of interest is climate change, climate movement, environmental activism, all that. I volunteer with a different organization, 350, and I've been doing that for about a year now. It's grassroots climate activism. And the main thing that I'm passionate about in that space is youth involvement and uplifting the voices of young advocates. And I'm excited to join you all tonight for our last panel.
Kelly, do you want to jump in there?
Sure thing. Yeah, I would be typing in what country I'm coming from in the chat, but I'm on my phone and I don't really want you guys to see my nose hairs up close and personal when I type it in. So I'm coming from Noongar country over in Perth. And I am the chairperson for gender equality with Voices of Influence. My background in studies is social justice and journalism. So I've been working as a journalist for the last year and a half, just with local community newspapers. And my work in that space is mainly focused on housing and homelessness, women's rights, and where that intersects with the experiences of First Nations people specifically. Before that, I was working with Plan International, which is a charity for children and has now streamlined itself as being a charity for girls' rights specifically. So in that space, I was working on their community events and fundraising team, so doing community engagement, and learning a little bit about partnerships and fundraising and what sort of goes on behind the scenes in the campaign space. Anyway, really excited for this. I'm really excited to hear more about the social outfit from Camila. So this is actually going to be more of a learning thing for me than a talking thing. So yeah.
Absolutely. I think we all have a lot to learn from each other. That's the best thing about these panels, is you walk away having gained more lessons, which is fantastic. Jacinda, do you want to say a quick hello?
Sure, thank you, Alice. Agree on the learning front. These panels have definitely given me as much learning as I hope we've given to these students throughout our journey together. I'm Jacinta. I'm the Justice and Communities Chair at Voices of Influence. In my day-to-day life, I also work at Tramby, which is an Aboriginal controlled education not-for-profit. I'm passionate about decolonising systems and how decolonisation aids and assists in the climate sustainability conversation. I also am in the process of starting a small little social enterprise looking at kind of stigmatizing periods and also creating sustainable options for period pants for women facing homelessness and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women at risk or experiencing family violence.
Fantastic, thank you. I will introduce myself now. So you all know me as Alice, and I am the founding director of Voices of Influence Australia. And Voices of Influence Australia, we are a youth-led organisation which functions to move and encourage the masses who are passive individual consciences into being active collective voices for human rights. And we haven't been established for very long. Only in March this year we've been established, but we've made some significant traction towards that vision and mission, which is beyond exciting, and probably one of my proudest achievements so far. So my background is in social work. I'm now studying international law. I have worked in a lot of different areas. I started off working in mental health, where I was an advocate for clients or participants going through the New South Wales Mental Health Review Tribunal. I then stepped into international development, where I worked with Child Fund and did a lot of work for the rights of children, specifically in the Asia Pacific area. I've recently stepped into the role of International Partnerships Director with Oaktree, which is an incredibly dynamic role, which again works with Timor-Leste and Cambodia with some phenomenal youth-led initiatives and programs and projects there. And like I said before, here with Voices of Influence as well. My main passion, as I'm sure has come through previous panels, but is youth participation and really mobilizing young people in the pursuit of human rights and social justice and sustainability. I really am a strong believer, and I can bore everyone to tears to say that I think young people, they need to be not seen as just receivers or pledges of social justice, but they are solutions of social justice as well, whether that be through advocacy, activism, or establishing initiatives and social enterprises. So I'm sure these will all be concepts that we start to dismantle a little bit more through the time that we have here this evening. To give you a little bit of idea of the structure, we've got Camila here for the first hour with us, which I'm really eager for us to learn as much as we can from her and hear as much of her story and the social outfit story. So we'll spend the first probably 15 minutes discussing that, and then we'll go into a bit more of an open panel discussion about social enterprises. So Camila, I'm happy for you to take the floor, but I think the first question would be what does the social outfit do?
Sure. Thank you. The social outfit is a social enterprise / charity. So we are also a registered charity in Australia, and we exist to employ and train refugee women and new migrant women here in Sydney, and we do it through fashion. As simple as that. We do a number of different things. We make clothes, so we hire refugee women. Everything we sell in our shop is only made by refugee women, normally on their first Australian job. So just picture a woman who's come fleeing conflict in Syria, where she's over 50 years old. She knows how to sew. She has never spoken English before. She comes to Australia, really, really hard to get a job, but she has some beautiful skills. So that's what we have upstairs. Right above me is our workroom, where the women come and are paid fair wages for their work. We did that for a few years and then realized, hold on a second, we're also selling these clothes. And we have a shop, which is down here, well, in the front. I'm actually now sitting in the kitchen. Why don't we use that space as well? So our store has become a training ground for young new migrants, 18 to 29 years old. Picture the woman arriving from Iran or Iraq, having done the HSC, a bit in a rush, intensive English classes, and then out of the system's got to find a job. And it's basically impossible to find that first job. We get them in here, we offer them a traineeship, we pay them Australian award wages while we train them. We keep them for 3 months, we teach them everything there is to know about customer service, retail. How do you just talk to customers? How do you process an online sale? How do you visually merchandise a shop? But just really giving them all the skills we think they need to prepare them for the next job. And then the other angle of what we do is that as we focus on this training and employment, we also don't want to harm the environment. So all of the clothes that we made are made with donated excess fabric, meaning the fashion industry in Australia, we reach out to them and they give us their waste, but their waste can often be hundreds of meters of beautiful linen that they just decided isn't the right color for them to use anymore. Sometimes it's small little scraps that we have to patchwork and figure out what to do with, but sometimes it's meterage. So we have saved over 9 tons of fabric from going into landfill to date. That's just a bit of a quick overview.
Wow, no, I think talk about, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. That's a fantastic. And I think I read an article recently talking about, like, especially in the fashion industry, just the mass of waste that there is, particularly in Australia and globally. So I think, I'd heard of initiatives, in the hospitality sector, like Second Plate, which has a similar model where they go around to supermarkets and restaurants and collect meals that haven't been used and then distribute them to communities. But I'm so pleased to hear that there enterprises like the Social Outfit that are having that similar model and really focus on sustainability and cutting back on that waste as well. It's so important. But I guess so another question that pops to mind as well is, so how do you and your team measure your impact at Social Impact? The Social Outfit.
Yes. Lots of measurements, measurements of clothes and measurement of impact, lots of work going into, and we look at both quantitative and qualitative impact. So we track everything, right? So it's numbers, it's spreadsheets. How many women have we employed? How much money have we paid directly in the hands of these women? How many of them were on their first Australian job? How many years before? So we have all of that data. So I can tell you that to date, we have been existing for 7 years, which is pretty good for a social enterprise because it can be a very tough environment. And in 7 years, we have provided 53 women with employment, and 88% were on their first Australian job. That's really important because the first job is really hard to get. Now, over 90% of the women that we have employed, we have been able to transition to ongoing employment. So this is all the kind of quantitative data that we collect and we analyze, and we have all the spreadsheets. And then there's the qualitative. What does this actually mean? What difference has this made to your life? And what is the importance of this? Is this just another job? Did you, because those stories are really important. And talking to the women when they start with us throughout the program and before they leave gives us a lot of information around how do we improve what we're doing? Are we targeting the right women? And is there more we should do? For example, for many years, because we're also in this space where showing your impact and showing your numbers is so important, for a long time we were focused on quickly transitioning women out so we could get more women in. Now we're learning that actually that's not necessarily the best thing. We want to make sure that before we transition our women out, we have given them every chance, and that some of them actually should not be transitioned out. They should be staying with us for a number of reasons, not alone the fact that they help us continue to grow and build. If we continually get new women in and then send them out, we are back to square one at every time, rather than becoming more professional in how we build this social enterprise. So measuring impact is a must. Measuring it well, it's really difficult. You have to spend a lot of time and a lot of thinking around doing it. In order to measure quantitative impact, you also need to have the trust of the people you're talking to, and that takes time. So we find that often the first conversation and the first interview might not be the most solid one, but after we have developed that relationship with the woman and there is that confidence and that trust, we can have a much more meaningful understanding of the path that they are on.
Absolutely. It sounds like as a team, you guys have a really strong ethos for constantly monitoring and evolving as an organization and questioning what are we doing well, what could we doing better, which is, I think, kind of it demonstrates that how the Social Outfit isn't this static entity, and it's dynamic, and it responds to the dynamic landscape of social enterprises and social justice, which is something that is hard to be agile to sometimes, just because of the dynamics of it. I think probably a question that comes from that as well is, so I guess up until this point, you've said that you're really defining that impact through the data is quite a challenge, but what are the biggest challenges that you and your team face at the Social Outfit at the moment?
There's a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities, but the biggest challenge is potentially the financial one. Are we going to have enough money to continue to stay open? I mean, when you're a social enterprise, you are trying to operate like a business, but you do not have the resources of a business. So we're in the business of making beautiful clothes and selling beautiful clothes. But we are competing with companies that have money for marketing, that can do a really aggressive campaign by which they appear to be super ethical, and they are not, for example. But we don't have that money to kind of build our presence in a very, very crowded space. So how do we increase our sales when we want to actually spend the money that we have on training up women, right? And then there's a lot of what I found very interesting in the discourse about social enterprises is that a lot of donors and supporters expect a social enterprise to start generating revenue within 5 years. They want a social enterprise to be working as a business. But we also need to reflect on the fact that if there was a really strong business model for what we do and other social enterprises do, then you don't need a social enterprise, then you'll have a business. But we are a social enterprise for a reason. We are paying our workers by the hours, proper rates, and some days they're not able to work very well because they have all sorts of backgrounds and and things that happen. A lot of them are being trained. We're still paying them. They're not as fast as they would be if they were hired in private. So how do we explain that constantly to our donors and our supporters so we can keep having our doors open while we try to become a business? So the social outfit is probably one of the most successful social enterprises in Australia to date. Simple as the fact that we have survived for 7 years, that we are on a growth path. But is what we sell through the shop sufficient to support us? No, it's not. Are we increasing the percentage of our operational budget that is supported by the shop? Yes, we are. So the trajectory is going right. But do we want to be 100% funded by the business? I'm not sure, because that would mean that we probably would have to stop doing a lot of things that we think are really valuable, but don't generate our revenue. And so I think that is the dilemma for social enterprises. I want to continue offering free sewing classes. I want to continue doing the retail training program, which makes no business sense per se, but actually is really needed by the community I'm looking to empower. So that's the challenge. It's to talk to donors and make them understand that you're still a very successful business, even if you still need their philanthropic support in order to keep your doors open.
Of course. And I think like hearing it, like it says you guys have been around for 7 years, and to see that you've had this continual like growth, whether that's been social impact, but even just being able to sustain yourselves as well, I think is significant success. As we know that, you know, the social enterprise climate is incredibly fragile and it's really hard to balance and to execute correctly. I think a question that comes to mind, which is perhaps a slightly more pointed question, and I know you said you've been with them, did you say you've been with them for about 2 years? Is that what?
Yeah, 2.5.
2.5 years. I guess the question I have is, so since you started working with the social enterprise, how, like, what has, sorry, I keep saying the wrong name, the social outfit, how have you seen that like grow in the last 2 years? What has it become in the last 2 years? And I guess, what is your vision for the social outfit over the next 2 years, 4 years, wherever you see yourself going?
Yeah, good question. Well, I am proud to say that it's grown a lot since I've joined. And I think that has to do with the fact that I came in with a different mindset and started trying different things. And that is not really because I'm so great, but it's just because, again, changing the, bringing in someone from a different sector that might approach something in a different way is always beneficial. The most significant thing that happened since I started was that I managed to convince a foundation to fund me to hire a partnership and fundraising manager. So actually I have a person that dedicates their time to thinking about how do we continue to grow and how do we continue to raise those monies that we need to do the charitable work that we do. So what is my dream for the social outfit? So maybe if I come back for a second, there are two things that I learned in my international development career that I really was very convinced about. One is that if you give women a job, you have probably the biggest impact you can get. Giving employment to a woman that hasn't had employment has long-lasting trickling down effect into the community. The other thing I learned working many years in peace and conflict is that it doesn't matter how peaceful any place in the world is. Sydney is very peaceful. But if you don't strengthen and build social cohesion, any place is at risk of violence if something happens. An economic crisis in Sydney, housing prices go down, there can be violence unless you build that social cohesion. So what the social outfit does really, really well is exactly this. It provides women with employment, and the women that we're dealing with only 20% of refugee women in Australia are employed currently. So there's a huge need for that. And it builds social cohesion. Even it does it between Sydney-siders and the refugee that work here because they can meet in the shop, but it does it also between the refugees that work here. And we often forget, because we talk about refugees as they're one group. Refugees are actually simply people from many different countries that for some reason or another have had to leave their country. But there are barriers between somebody who comes from Burma and somebody who comes from Somalia and somebody who comes from Iran. So that's what we do here. They work together and we break those barriers. So the social outfit, to me, is really an example of multicultural Australia at its best. This is what we should be doing, having fun, making beautiful clothes, empowering women. I want this to be an example. And I want this to work because I want this to be replicated. And I want this to be replicated. We are currently in the middle of our plans to expand to Western Sydney, to get closer to the women, to have a bigger manufacturing in Western Sydney. I hope the next step is going out of state. And I hope the next step after that is going internationally, because there are so many countries that could do with innovative examples of how do you break those barriers and provide employment where it's needed. You know, I'm Italian. I can't think of a better place than Italy, where there's migrants coming in every minute that are looking for jobs. And there's a fashion industry that really wants those clothes made. So yeah, that's where I'm hoping to take it one day.
Fantastic. Who knows? Maybe the social outfit will be piloting at the Milan Fashion Week next year, whatever it is, like post-COVID. I think that's an amazing vision to have. And I recognize the potential of that. I think that's phenomenal. I think the final question I have for you before we open up to the rest of the panel, is you mentioned just before that a large group of the communities that you focus on are young women between the ages of 18 and 29. Was that a very decisive or a conscious decision, like for youth empowerment as well, or did it just so happen to fall into those two categories?
No, I think we really thought about it a lot. Who do we want to focus on and where is the biggest need? And while for the workroom upstairs, you know, the biggest need is not for the young women, is for the over 40s, because they are going to find real challenges in finding employment. However, they have those sewing skills and they find real challenges in improving their English. Therefore, a work where they can use their hands and communicate that way might be an easier option. We also recognize that a lot of these young women who have arrived, haven't been here very long, don't have the networks and connections, are going to find it really, really hard to find a job and not be exploited. So they can work in restaurants in the various suburbs, for example, but we want to make sure that they are fulfilling their potential and that they also believe that Sydney is their home now, and that's all about building their confidence. And so we felt that if we empower these young women with their first job, well, then they have their whole life where they can continue to grow and flourish. And how important is that? And I can tell you, working here, because I work directly with these women, you know, this is a small social enterprise, we're all together. You see these girls, you know, they arrive, they are shy, they haven't been to this part of town, but within 2 or 3 weeks, they just, you know, their confidence just, and they just, you know, they're all going on to other jobs, and they don't have to be jobs in retail. They can be anything they want to do. And a couple of them have actually moved on and just gone to business school because they realized they like to set up their own social enterprises, and they're studying business now. It's just about, you know, opening that door of possibilities, and the impact that you can have is enormous, especially at that age.
Absolutely. I think just hearing that, you know, within a couple of weeks that you're seeing this transformation in the people that you're working with, I think just speaks so much to the legacy that the social outfit is having. I'm excited by the fact that you are involving young people in this space as well. I think, especially for like young migrants, it's about emotional, economic, social, and political participation, and that empowerment, like even just getting into the workforce or building those skills is such an incubator for that. Thank you so much for sharing the story of the social social outfit. I've just learned a fantastic amount about it, not only about the social outfit, but just about the complexity of it as well. Unless the panel or those joining us in the audience, unless you have any other questions directly for Camila, we might open up to the rest of the panel to have a bit more of a general discussion. But yeah, anyone else on the panel, did you have any other questions for Camila? No?
I'm a bit curious, Camila, because obviously you were talking about the various challenges you faced, and we were speaking about this before the students joined, but how like specifically did COVID like really impact the social outfit? Because obviously I know the shopfront would not be able to open and a whole various amount of things.
Great question.
So it impacted us in many different ways, but we actually managed to make the most of it. And ultimately, we did really well during COVID. So the first hit, I was really worried. I actually just suspended my own salary because I thought we're not going to survive this. I mean, 85% of our sales happen through the store and not online. We're going to be forced to be shut. How can I pay the rent? Essentially, that was the biggest concern. A few people came to me and said you should make face masks, and I was like, really? I don't want to kind of make money out of a bad situation. It kind of felt a bit odd. And then we spoke about it as a team, and we came up with an idea, and we said, okay, we'll make face masks. We'll use all our fabric scraps, but we will only sell a face mask if the customer is willing to donate. So essentially buy two, and one we will donate to a person in need. We didn't think about the PR power of this. We just thought that's the right thing to do. But it got picked up by so many magazines and the news that we ended up selling so many face masks. During the first wave of COVID, I had to hire 5 additional sewers, and we made 10,000 face masks. So it was just like, it became a face mask factory, which is not necessarily what we wanted to do, but it helped us through, and we provided employment to more women at a time when their husbands were losing their employment and their income. So it was amazing. This year, when it hit, incredible luck, I would say. We were featured on a TV show on Channel 10 called The Living Room. It took a long time to do this show. We're really, again, nervous. Are they going to trivialize what we do? But it's important to be, out there and talk. What effect will it going to have? Well, it happened that we were on TV the night they announced lockdown. The following day we were closed, and we were closed for 4 months. But the power of being featured on Channel 10 for an hour on a TV show meant that our online sales went through the roof. So we had half of our workforce that was not in LGAs of concern that could keep on coming in. We scheduled them so we never had more than 2 women in the workroom at any one time, and we kept producing. And those sales managed, we managed to get through it. And we reopened on the 23rd of October, I suppose, and everybody came back to work with a lot of energy to try and make this spring summer collection, which we kind of managed to launch sometimes in November. So again, I think it's all about being flexible, saying yes to everything. Again, the TV show, I could have said no. Who wants to be on a TV show? But it's a part of it is also to take the opportunities and go with it.
I think also what that speaks to, Camila, is like us responding with agility too. I think that's like such a big thing to I can't remember if we've said it already in this panel, if it was before we invited the others in, but talking about how, the incredibly complex landscape of social enterprises and how important that skill is to respond to agility to changing times. And I think COVID's definitely tested the limits of that agility for a lot of and social enterprises, but that's phenomenal to hear that even through a very challenging time, that the social outfit was able to continue its impact. Fantastic. Well, if anyone who's joining us in the audience at the moment, if you have any other questions, add it to the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and join into the conversation. But I might open up to the rest of the panel to kind of talk about social enterprises at large and the issues that arise from it and the strengths that arise from it as well. So the first question that we wanted to discuss was, so what role do social enterprises play in the development of an inclusive and diverse society? society, one that broadens social, economic, and political participation and is more equitable, stable, and sustainable. We've just seen through the social outfit a fantastic case study of what that can achieve. But I'd love to open up to the panel to continue this conversation. Camila, I'm happy for you to start off, but if you want to break from talking, I totally understand as well.
Oh no, I'm happy. I mean, I think it's, you know, I can only talk by example, you know, and I believe, I'll tell you one thing. Our first sewer, she was in Australia for 17 years. She was a refugee from Burma, a beautiful sewer. She had been looking for work for 17 years. If we didn't have a social enterprise that was focused on hiring her and giving her that chance, she's now retired. She's become a grandmother. She had 7 children, so she's now opted to stop working with us, but she was with us for 7 years. Her name is Esther. If we hadn't existed, she wouldn't have had that experience. And through employment, she gained so much strength and independence, and it's just something that is needed. And the business sector isn't going to do it, because to hire someone who might, you know, there's no references. As simple as that. There's no previous employer you can call up to say, hey, does she show up to work on time, or things like that. And therefore, they're immediately eliminated from the candidate list. You need a social enterprise to focus on. We focus on refugee women, but there's many other focuses that social enterprise can have to actually give these people a chance, or whatever area it is you want, give them a chance. And ultimately, you know, Esther was the most talented sewer and just making extremely beautiful things. So she would have deserved a job anywhere in the fashion industry. And I think that's an example that you know, speaks so much.
What a fantastic story. I think I've heard, I think before we let everyone in, we had a conversation about a friend of mine who works with youth-led initiatives, and part of it is in India. He was saying there's over, you know, hundreds of millions of women there who have the capacity, who already have the sewing skills, and young women that have the sewing skills there. They have the drive, they have the initiative, but it's about really creating an incubator for that initiative, that support, that like building, like capacity building, and allowing them to have that participation in society. And for me, that always comes back down to like that participation is a fundamental human right. And I know it's really hard for human rights not to be politicized. It'd be, you know, I'd rather utopian world if we were to, everyone was just able to agree that human rights should be realized and supported and protected. But participation is a fundamental human right. And I think Australia, we have a massive area of growth in that space here about how we can realize that, particularly for new migrants coming in. Meg and Kelly, Jacinta, do you have anything you want to add to the conversation?
I was just going to add that, you know, I see the real difference, as Camila so beautifully articulated, and you drew off as well, Alice, that, you know, social enterprises are about building community, whereas businesses are about building a capitalist portfolio. And that, you know, may not sound that difference when you think about the fact that, as Camila said, social enterprises still face so many funding challenges, and funding is still such a big part of the conversation and the worries, and most social enterprises don't make it out of, I think it's the first 3 to 5 years. But, you know, there is such a possibility within social enterprises when you're not only answering to the profit margin, when you're able to be innovative, when you're able to say, as Camila beautifully expressed, like, it's about employing more women, it's not necessarily about overturning a profit. When you have CEOs who are willing during a pandemic to pause their own salary, that's just not something we're going to see in the business space. And I think, you know, we need to be really critical of those capitalist systems and of the governmental system in this country that they come down from. When we look at, you know, the recent report that was released this week about the horrific sexual abuse and misconduct that continually happens in our parliament, and we can't be surprised that it continues to happen in our business spaces. And unfortunately, I think those systems can start changing, but it's hard to change when you're being comparative to other businesses that are in that same mindset. I think social enterprises can push businesses
to be more community focused and to actually change a bit of that business structure that otherwise won't happen. So I really think social enterprises, on top of all of the good they do in creating community, in being purpose-led, not profit-focused, it's also about shining a light of other ways of doing business that don't have to be harming our environment, that don't have to be at the detriment of young people or women, or, as you said, exploitation, which is the common theme that we see in workforce engagement with refugee and migrant women and communities in general. You know, it not only is a possibility of creating community and pushing change and holding, you know, community to account for social rights and human rights, but it also creates an alternative for us to hold businesses to account and say, we no longer accept those kind of practices as just regular business operations.
If I can jump in on that, I think that that's absolutely to the point, Jacinta. And I would just add one more thing. I think one responsibility, or one thing that social enterprises do so well, is also educate the consumers, because it's once the consumers are educated that they can push on the other businesses as well to change the way they do things. And I'll give you another example, because I actually like to, you know, things being very concrete, and I'm learning. We have a lot of customers that say, well, why is it so expensive? The fabric is donated. Why is it so expensive? So, well, first of all, the fabric is such a small cost of the production of an item. We pay Australian award wages. These women are paid by the hours and they live in Australia. And then they would say, oh, but you know, across the street is also made in Australia. And so I've learned, and I'm educating our customers, that actually made in Australia doesn't mean ethically made, as many believe. So everybody believes it's made in Bangladesh, it's bad, it's made in Australia, it's good. It can be quite the opposite. Nowadays, it can actually be made in Bangladesh and be really good. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but made in Australia, most goods that are in the fashion industry made in Australia are made with what's called a piece rate. Sewers work in their homes or in their garage, and they negotiate a rate per piece. And often that rate is very, very low. So they might be paid $5 per napkin that they sew. Nobody is there to see how long it takes to make that napkin, and very often it might take them an hour. That means they're paid $5 an hour. And then we're talking about not having slavery in Australia and things being bad in Bangladesh. So what we do on a daily basis is actually talk to consumers, so the next time they assume that made in Australia means ethical, they might actually question that. And that's the only way we can get those businesses to stop paying per piece, but actually paying their sewers the proper wages.
Yeah, definitely. Going off what Camila just said, I think one of the really key parts of a social enterprise is that it educates its consumers, because someone might go, for example, to the social outfit and they're not going there because they know it's ethical, they know it's sustainable, they know that they employ migrant women, but they make the choice to buy something there. And, you know, then they have the realization and they learn like all the positive sides of the business. And maybe like then they'll have you know, the thought that perhaps that's the type of shopping that they want to now undertake. They might go research more into that business. They might learn more about something, about social enterprises in general. And so like, that's a really positive aspect, is when we integrate it with like other businesses that don't perhaps function in the same way. You know, people can by mistake or by accident just like stumble upon these businesses and then continue to make more positive actions in the future.
I was just going to jump on that as well, because I think that's really the value that people like activists and advocates and the social workers who are joining in can actually add to these spaces. Because I think we talk a lot about moving from that awareness raising activism space into actually taking affirmative action in that space to educate our community and to be of service and to generate those places where we can actually make a tangible difference in the community. So I think when we're talking about social enterprises, it's a really good avenue for you know, people who are involved in advocacy and activism to take it to that next step and get involved in something that's then actually taking you out of that digital space of just raising awareness or showing up to the protests, and actually working in that community building space that's, you know, targeting the root issues that you're advocating for.
I think something that just like keeps ringing in my head hearing all of you speak, and it kind of is something that came up in a conversation a few days ago I had with a friend who's very active in this space. But he said that the reason that there's so much resistance for either non-for-profits or businesses to kind of take on this social enterprise model is that social enterprises, it's kind of putting a big middle finger up to capitalism. It's putting a big middle finger up to these structures and also like oppressive structures and systems, which we've been conditioned to think that this is the only way of functioning. A lot of businesses have been conditioned to think the only way that we can measure impact is through our profit, and rather than recognizing the impact it has on our social, economic, and political outputs. I think he summarized it so well, like just saying, yeah, it's a big middle finger up to capitalism and say we're changing things. But I think that another comment that he made, and I apologize for sounding repetitive, but he was saying in the global south, there's this massive movement of social enterprises happening. And he said he recognizes a massive resistance in countries of the global north to really take on this social enterprise model. And he always brings it back to capitalism and how, like, yeah, our vision of how we measure impact, how we think businesses should be run is always goes back down to what we can contribute economically, which as we've seen is it fails our social and political well-being, it fails our social and political participation. So I think hearing all of you speak as well, I think it also just rings true the potential and the momentum of social enterprises to really have social or transformative effects in our society, which typical business and not-for-profit frameworks haven't really been able to achieve. I think so many rich conversations coming on from that, but perhaps we'll move on to another question before we see Camila head off. But I think another thing that came out from that was talking about, I think Jacinta, you brought it up, and Camila, you brought it up as well, but talking about leadership in social enterprises as well. And Jacinta, you said, you know, how many businesses, leaders or CEOs would forfeit their own salary for the benefit of social enterprises. So Camila, I would love to start with you, seeing as you are in a leadership position in a social enterprise, but how have you seen your leadership skills have to adapt to this environment? And how has that been different to other conventional models you might have been working in or structures you've been working in? And perhaps an even more pointed question is how can those in the social enterprise sector, how can they be better leaders in order to further this movement?
Well, that's a tricky question. Well, I came into this role already thinking, if I am to be successful in my role of CEO, I am not going to be here in 5 years' time. A refugee woman will be. So I actually came with the desire of making myself out of the job, because this is how I want to run this place and where I believe it needs to go. Now, I had a long career in international development, and I loved many things about it, but I did really, really hate how there was this climb for power and the ego. And, you know, it was mostly, let's be frank, it was mostly men in gray suit, but that doesn't mean that it can't be women and it can't be younger women as well. But there was this backstabbing and competition and just this drive for power. And when I decided to take a massive salary cut, because that's the other thing which is tricky. When I was 30 and I was raising a family and I was living in New York City, I couldn't have done it on the salary of the social enterprise that I am on now. So that's a big ask somehow. You know, I am very privileged that at this age, I'm able to say, look, I don't care about slashing my salary in half because this is what I want to do. But not everybody can do that. And so that needs to change if you want to have the best possible leaders of a social enterprise. But still today, at least in Australia, if you want to lead a social enterprise, you cannot have a salary that is competitive to what your salary would be in other fields. So is that good or bad? Somehow it will force. Let me expand a little bit more on that. So in my dream that my role would be taken over by a refugee CEO, when I was talking to other entities that support refugees in employment, they said, that's not fair. If a refugee comes to the level of skills to be the CEO, they should have a proper salary. So they should be somewhere else because they have to support a whole community and family, and probably family back home. They're not like you, Camilla. So, you know, that's a big dilemma, and that's something that we need to discuss and address and resolve, because I don't think it's resolved yet. You know, for me, it was a very personal choice, and again, a very privileged choice that I was able to make. Not everybody can do that, but we need to change that, because we want the social enterprise world not only to attract those who can afford not to have a huge salary, you know, and I don't, you know, and I think it's similar in the social work, etc. We're all expected, because we love what we do and we believe in community, to have very low salaries. And I'm not saying it should be like, you know, the law firms or the banks here in, you know, those multi-million dollars, but it should be competitive enough that people are paid what they should be paid in these kinds of roles, because otherwise you risk that it's either going to be somebody who's very young in their career, or you know, or some, you know, you limit the possibilities.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing up the point of privilege as well. And I think that's a very, obviously, was the catalyst for your decision to like in the challenge of COVID. But I resonate so deeply with what you said, is that people that find themselves or like drawn or have a calling to this space, there should be that at least a wage that allows them to have a good quality of life without those sacrifices as well. Camilla, Jacinta, Kelly, or Meg, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I was just gonna say, and like I bang on about this like almost every single time, but the concept of a love ethic and leadership, and how I just think that, well, I think Camilla's like demonstrating what it is to actually be a loving leader, and how in being a loving leader, you have to focus on community. Your decisions have to be driven by what's best for the community. And even talking about being willing to, you know, step down from a position of power, or willing to sacrifice pay. And yeah, while that comes with privilege, it's also that having that, coming from like a heart space in leadership. And I just think that that's so prevalent in social enterprises, and I think that's another reason why social enterprises differentiate so much from other areas where, you know, like you say, in politics and things like that, where people aren't operating from a love ethic. People are operating, being driven by profit, being driven by growth, being driven by their own ego and their own power base. And I just think it's really important that we acknowledge the fact that Camilla's leadership style is coming from a place of love, and a lot of places, or a lot of leaders in social enterprises, are coming from that place. And we should really celebrate that, and we should really look at that as something that we aspire to. When I think in the world we have so many role models that people are aspiring to that aren't coming from that place. Like I tutor a little boy who's like 10 years old, and his like big like role model is Elon Musk, and I sort of think like, is he operating from a love ethic though? So I just think it's really good that we acknowledge that, and just try and pay attention to that.
I think as well, something that, and I agree with everything you said, Kelly, something that came out of Camilla speaking is that idea of collaboration. And I don't think that is something we've done well in a not-for-profit sector. It is still, unfortunately, a bit driven by ego sometimes. And I see this, you know, I work for a not-for-profit. I see this all the time with other not-for-profits that we engage with, and I won't name any names, but, you know, leadership who has been there for 15 years. And the conversation we were having before the students came on was about the importance of change. And, you know, although I can understand that the social enterprise world and the not-for-profit space it's going to take a long time for the salaries to get competitive. And certainly we see this all the time. It's hard to get people to stay for, you know, 2 to 4 years, which is a time that really allows the organization to grow, when they can get a job paying double the amount in a corporate sector. And there's so many other conversations that need to happen around how we maybe collaborate more with corporates and show that they need to put their money where their mouth is, and there needs to be an index of their funding that goes right back into the communities where they operate, which I don't think we've done very well in Australia, of holding those corporates to account to invest in the communities where they operate and where they benefit from the kind of community ethos that's already established. But in terms of that collaboration, you know, Camilla, it really made my heart sing with joy to hear you say, you were hoping that in 5 years, you entering this position, 5 years of success looked like you weren't in that position. And I think we need to cultivate that mindset in leaders. And that comes down to collaborative leadership, that people don't get in a position of power and decide that they're going to ride the gravy train or, you know, continue moving the organization forward only with their ideas for change and their kind of control over that growth. Because without having new voices come into organizations, you know, we can say this in corporate, not-for-profit and social enterprise, but we see it, I think, a lot very commonly in corporates and also not-for-profits, of without welcoming change, without welcoming new perspectives, without acknowledging that change has to happen with new voices and innovation that comes with people from different sectors, we're not going to have a very healthy model. And I have seen a few social enterprises in my small, you know, life of being a professional fail within the first 3 years because they're not willing to open themselves up to more collaborative ways of working, to more collaborative ways of being. And they think that the mandate that they set for themselves when they started is the mandate that they have to continue operating on. And it becomes a bit of an ego trip that they think if they say, okay, we can actually do this better than we've been doing, then they're opening themselves up to criticism and they're opening themselves up to failure. And we see this happening in corporate environments all the time. And we need to get out of that mindset. You know, failure is a tool of learning. It's never failure if you're willing to look at the mistake and hear other voices and learn how to do it differently and learn how to do it better. But when we're raised in this idea that leadership is one person, that leadership is one voice, that leadership is lacking vulnerability, leadership is not listening to everyone's voice in a room, you know, we lose other perspectives, we lose other ways of working and doing and being. And this comes back to decolonizing systems. You know, when we as a white hegemonic society in Australia deny the truth of this country, deny that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and culture exist and is living and thriving, we don't allow the narrative of this country and the way that we do things to change, the way that we see things to change. And we see this in the, you know, the climate movement all the time. And we're just, you know, we're reliving the same problem, we're reliving the same conversation. And I do really think, you know, your leadership has shown, Camila, like social enterprises are a way for us to change that model and to acknowledge that it has to be purpose over profit. But more than that, it has to be about collaborative leadership. Otherwise, you know, we won't survive as people and we certainly won't thrive as a society.
It also, it's just so much more fun. Like, you know, the team here takes decisions together. We just brainstorm around things and it's, you know, you get to see things differently. I mean, when I took over the social outfit, the founder had left. She had left a few months before, so I didn't have the benefit of the handover, which I think in retrospect was a blessing because I could just come and, you know, take this in places. But what I think had happened with the founder, who was a great woman and really believed in it, is that she came into this social enterprise with one idea of how it was going to work. And she kept on that idea because that's how she had envisioned this place. And she left because it wasn't moving forward. I'm by no means smarter than her, but I came in with a much more open, because I didn't create this place, I didn't found it. I was just like, okay, what are the possibilities? What do we do here? And the first thing I did was to build a team, and you know, we have fun together and we make all the decisions together. But how do you know, I've had so much ego for so many years that's what I wanted to get away from. So I'm very, very clear about what bad ego can do, and how it can drive you to hit walls over and over and make enemies, and how collaboration is really important. But how do we teach it? How is that something that when you're young and you're starting in a role, you can just keep in mind and do? I mean, I can only say that I don't want to repeat what I've seen and what I've suffered, but it's taken me 25 years of, you know, abused by powerful people in different positions to say, I'm not going to repeat that. But we want it to happen much earlier on. in people's career. So I leave that thought to you of saying, how do you encourage this so that you can change and in all sectors, because it should be in all sectors, you know, whatever sector you're working in. We know that collaboration and opening it up from people from different walks of life and different backgrounds is what brings about innovation. How do we get it done?
I think it's a big question, and I think a brilliant question to sign off, Camila, for you to jump off. I'm conscious of the time, and I know you have to run off quickly. If you had to have us a couple of minutes to spare, there's a couple of questions in the group, in the chat, that the people attending have asked. Do you need to run away, or have you got?
No, I can do. I did see a question. I was about to say, I'm going to quickly
Okay.
ask. I saw one, but maybe there's another one. The one I did read was about, have I thought about also supporting women victims of domestic violence? Yes, I have, and I am doing that because sadly, a lot of refugee women that work here are also victims of domestic violence. So one of our partners is WAJEC, the Women and Girls Emergency Center in Redfern. They refer a lot of the customers. So we do have refugee women that are not only are they refugees, they have come here, they're victim of and they become homeless because they're trying to escape situations. So it becomes even more important to give them a job so they can rebuild their lives. It happens over and over, sadly. We are looking for the combination. We are not just looking for victims of domestic violence. We could, but I need another 10. Sadly, I would need another 10 social outfits to be able to do that. So yeah.
I see the potential of that, Camila. It's not, who's to say the timeline, but I see the potential of that, and I can see the expanse of how the social outfit can grow.
What we need is all of you to buy your Christmas presents online or in store, and tell all your friends, you know, I have unlimited capacities to produce more and to hire more women. What I need is to sell more products. So, you know, spread the word and help us and support us in what we're trying to do.
Fantastic. I think that's a perfect way to sign things off. Camila, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your generosity of spirits, and your guidance. It's been absolutely delightful to have you join us this evening, and we've learned so much from you. I hope you've also found it a valuable exercise. And yeah, we look forward to, hopefully we can stay in touch and continue conversations like this.
Please come visit us in store or otherwise, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you and be part of this. Very inspiring, all of you. So thank you so much, and we'll reconnect another time. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow, that was phenomenal. For that, we only have recently connected with Camila and the social outfit, but they're doing some fantastic, brilliant stuff. And I think you just from that conversation, you can see the vision and the mission that herself and her team have as a social enterprise. They are a fantastic example of the potential and momentum and growth that social enterprises can have. I wanted to bring my attention, and I apologize for not bringing this up when Camila was with us, but I was mindful of the time that we had her for. But one of in the comments it says the definition of social enterprise is a two-way proposition that blends the best of business capitalism and innovation with social purpose. I think the social work profession needs to be more open to learning about other professions for social purpose. And I'm so glad that has been the takeaway from it. I think when we had the concept to kind of do a panel about social enterprises, that was the takeaway we wanted to have, is that there are so many skills that social workers have that can add value and that we can also learn from. And I think that also we'll go into breakout rooms in just a minute, but I wanted to spend about 5 minutes talking about one final question, which was talking about what value do social workers, advocates and activists bring to the advancement and development of social enterprises. And I don't know if one of my team want to kick things off. We'll keep it brief because I know we're mindful of the time to go into breakout rooms.
I think kind of like one of the first things, and as Camila was saying before, is that a lot of people who are activists or social workers or advocates who go into social enterprises don't go in knowing business or having had like customer service skills previously, but they do it because they're so passionate. And I think that's like one of the key things that advocates and social workers bring into that space is simply their passion, their lived experience, their understanding of various social issues. And then there is that aspect that you need collaboration on that point, as someone said in the comments. Yeah, just it's because obviously, as we've been saying with the social enterprise, you're not there for profit, you're not there knowing you're going to make money. And so having to have that passion as that first standing point is really important. Yeah.
I'd just add to, oh, sorry, Alice.
Go for it, Jacinta, go for it.
Yeah, I agree. I would add to that as well. Like, social workers have so many skills to add in just the way that, you know, you can connect with people, connect with vulnerable peoples, importantly. And social enterprises, as we were talking about with Camila, is all about building community. And as we all know, an important part of building community, particularly with vulnerable community members, is healing. And so social workers, maybe it's not about doing the business plan of a social enterprise, or maybe it's, you know, having the great idea or already being connected with the communities that are in need of this product, but it's also, or this service, but it's also about thinking about what is the actual human need in those people engaging with the service, whether they're engaging as employees or as receivers of a service that you're creating. And I think we often forget that because it's not really thought about in terms of the business mindset. It's always about, you know, what does your consumer want? It's never about what does that person need. Capitalism is all about giving us things that we don't need and harming the planet and our community connection or connectedness in the process. Whereas social enterprises, I suppose, try and rewrite that process, and it's about providing communities a service or a product that they need. And I think that's where the social workers and your skills and your knowledge and your experience working with vulnerable peoples really can kind of fill that gap, you know, in creating this amazing extending the amazing work of the social outfit. I'm sure Camila found that, as she said, she created team decision making. And that's about allowing refugee and migrant women to feel heard, have their opinions validated, you know, feel seen, not only gaining skills and economic independence, it's about feeling valued as a community member. And I think that's a really important trait of social workers that naturally fits in this space and this conversation.
Absolutely. No. Oh, Kelly, do you want to jump in?
I was going to just mention one specific thing that I've been thinking about the whole time. But just on the topic of like feminist activism and feminist advocacy specifically, like since like the first wave of feminism, the movement has been hyper commercialized. Like the suffragettes movement, they got on, and in a way it's been a positive thing. Like it has been a way of getting the message out, because we've lived in a capitalist society. So, you know, even in the early suffragettes movement, the big department stores were putting out like suffragettes uniforms, and the women could go and buy their suffragettes merch for their suffragettes march on the weekend. But throughout these different movements of feminism, women of colour have been largely excluded from these movements, and white feminism has become the dominant narrative and has been the face of feminist movements and the face of the advancement in gender equality. So it's really important to also acknowledge the fact that when we're getting on board with movements specifically around women's rights, that we're conscious of where we're putting our money, essentially. And I just have never kind of forgotten this like infographic that I saw, and it was like this caricature drawing of a woman in a sweatshop holding up a t-shirt that said girl power. And it was like, you know, we see this all the time where you're going and spending your money on brands that say that they align themselves with women's rights or specific like feminist merchandise and stuff like that. When in reality, a lot of these brands are exploiting women in other parts of the world. So I just think that specifically on the topic of feminism and social enterprise, if you're aligning with those movements, it's important that you're actually putting your money where your mouth is and thinking about what you're supporting when you go and buy things, and choosing to support social enterprises if you're in the financial capacity to do so.
I think thank you so much for bringing it up, Kelly. But when we were preparing for this event, this was something that came up in conversation, and it was that commercialization of feminism within particularly in the fast fashion industry as well. But the other thing that was, I think Meg has a lot more knowledge in this than I do, but this idea of greenwashing, and I think like I speak about them in the same breath because I think when talking about the capacity of social workers in social enterprises, I think we have the skills and we have the influence there to make sure that these organizations aren't just doing performative actions to, again, capitalize off trendy social, like human rights or social justice movements, and to make sure that like these are sustainable actions and not just performance of organizations trying to I guess, build their reach or build their audience or build the income of the organizations. And I know, Meg, you have a lot more knowledge in this space. So do you have anything else you want to add to that idea?
Yeah, because I was doing more research on it today, because obviously greenwashing is like a massive issue, because a lot of pre-established large businesses have just jumped on the movement of people wanting to buy more sustainably, buy more environmentally friendly. And I was specifically talking about it the other day with the girls, and we're talking about H&M and how H&M does a lot of greenwashing, and like whilst it does have like some benefits in a sense, which Kelly was saying before, it can raise awareness of a particular movement, and that is a positive thing obviously, but it's also just like terrible. H&M has a specific collection which they call the Conscious Collection, and it's said to be made with more sustainable, more environmentally friendly materials, and I was reading an article today that was saying that collection was found to contain a higher share of damaging synthetic materials than the main line. So even when they're pretending to do something like greenwashing and they're pretending to be environmentally friendly, they're not even doing that well. They're doing it even worse, which again is why things like social enterprises are so important, because they're not simply jumping on a bandwagon. They're not simply saying we're environmentally friendly and then not in following through. They're actually making real change. They're putting effort into things. And yes, like Camila was saying before, like those things end up being more expensive. They end up having less chance of succeeding in the business world. But it's so important that we put our money into these businesses because they're actually doing good things, unlike places like H&M.
On that point, Meg, if I can add, I 100% agree. And this is one of my biggest gripes with Apple products, because they pit themselves as the most environmentally friendly technology company, and they do good things, but it's that importance of us as consumers recognizing the quantitative difference. Sure, they provide a space for us to recycle our products, and they do so with them. However, they also create products that purposely break down within 2 years to perpetuate a cycle, which means we're harming our environment at a very fast rate because you cannot actually use the technology past the point of its expiry date, so that they force you to continue buying. And I think it comes down to that fact of we are waiting for companies to get better, and we need to acknowledge that we have the power. And that doesn't mean, you can't do anything if you can't afford something at a social enterprise. When I introduced Alice and the gals to the social outfit, I said, I love all of their clothes. I'm someone who loves clothes, but I cannot afford them at this stage in my life. And that's okay. I'll shop at Vinnie's, I'll shop at Red Cross and things like that. But just because you can't afford the social enterprise that does good doesn't mean the second alternative is going to H&M and feeling like, oh, well, I would go there except I can't afford it. It's about acknowledging, okay, well, I may not have the exact same fashions. And let's be honest, H&M or, any of those stores, they do something ridiculous, like 15 different fashion, I don't know what they call it, fashion seasons a year. It doesn't make sense, first of all, because we don't even have 15 different seasons in the climate to cater for. But, it requires us to be really critical about the fact that capitalism is designed to harm our planet, create more social division, and make us as individuals, especially women when we're talking about fashion, feel like we're not good enough as we are. So as social workers, as just good, citizens advocating for human rights, we need to be critical of when we are having these thought processes, like our value as human beings is tied to having the latest trend, rather than our value being tied to how we consciously use our money to benefit the entire community, whether that's local, national, or global, rather than being caught up in this whirlwind, expecting companies to change and continuing to empower them through giving them our hard-earned money and waiting for them to change in a change that will never happen because it's not advantageous to them.
I think, just summarize what you just said, Jacinta, I think that begs the question, and I think which is a question which a lot of us who are already conscious in this space is there such thing as ethical consumerism in a capitalist society? And I look, there's a lot of arguments that say that there isn't such thing as ethical consumerism when we have so many businesses, particularly like already strongly established and very powerful organizations which function because of capitalism. But I think this social enterprise movement, as I mentioned previously, is a dear friend of mine said that this social enterprise is putting a middle finger up to capitalism, and saying that there are different ways that we can have that ethical consumerism is possible, and it can have social impact, and it can create economic, social, and political participation. It can create community and heal communities. And I also think as social workers, we have we're one of the strongest stakeholders in that movement, is how I see it.
I can add one thing, and I know you want to jump into the breakout rooms, but I think you raise a really good point. There's ethical consumerism, which I think we've got to be conscious of the fact that most of the time buying ethically requires a serious investment of cash, which not everyone, particularly as students, not everyone has access to. So there's ethical consumerism, but we also need to remember there's conscious or mindful consumerism, which is, acknowledging that I may not have the power to actually, buy everything in a way that I would love to support a social enterprise or etc. But it's looking at what you can do. It could be as simple as, not eating meat every day because you know that, well, I can buy, 20 sausages from Coles for whatever price sausages are these days, or I could eat meat once a week and buy a good piece of meat that is ethically sourced and based in Australia. It's about changing our mindset so that every time we open our wallets, we open our purses, we acknowledge that A, we're not perfect humans, we are products of our environment, but stopping for a moment and asking yourself, do I actually need this? And secondly, where is my money supporting if I buy this, are ways that we can all be more conscious consumers, acknowledging that we can't all afford to be ethical consumers in every part of our lives.
Woo, big comments, but important comments. I actually want to open up to those who open the floor to the people that are attending. I know we have about 40 minutes left, but I want this to add value or have as much value to those of you that are attending. So I have a question for you all. We had planned to do a breakout room or breakout rooms to kind of continue the conversation, but would you rather that we just do an open forum here, an open Q&A, continue the discussion as it's going, or would you rather have a 20-minute breakout room and then come back and discuss what came out of those conversations? You can either use the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself. If I don't hear anything,
make a poll.
Make a poll. That's been my latest obsession lately, polls. Alana has
one vote for open forum.
Open forum. All right. I'm going to, unless anyone has any objections. Another, Kelly says, continue. Okay, all right, it's a resounding open forum. Fantastic.
Look at the collaborative decision-making and leadership in action.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, fabulous. Well, do we have, and someone said a resounding no breakout rooms, please. Okay, we've made a decision. So I guess to someone in the audience, do you want to, again, feel free to either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Is there any particular area that you would like to continue the conversation with, or a new topic that you would like us to discuss?
Can I just say before we go, I'm just going to run because I've needed to pee since we started. So bear with me.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, if we haven't got any in one of the comments volunteering anything, Meg or Jacinta, do you have anything that we haven't discussed so far that you think would be prudent or valuable to add to the conversation?
I do want to add one thing, but it's definitely what we've already been discussing.
Okay.
It was just kind of responding to what, obviously, I could yell about greenwashing and fast fashion forever because I hate it and it's it makes me so insanely angry. But I think, obviously, as Jacinta was saying, there's a difference between ethical consumerism and conscious consumerism, and there is a significant need for things like fast fashion for particular groups of people. If you cannot afford to buy anything other than something like H&M, then that's completely fine, and that's what you have to buy. You know, if you cannot afford to go to like a fresh grocers market and instead you have to buy like plastic packaged vegetables, that's completely fine. There is always a group of people who need those type of things. But yeah, as Jacinta was saying, it's all about making decisions in different areas of your life. Or if that's not even something you can handle, if you're someone who doesn't have to struggle with those type of things, recognizing that, you know, you have a sense of privilege in that space, and that you might have the ability to, you know, the actions you're making are the actions for two people, and perhaps you're replacing someone who can't, you know, buy better clothing or buy more organically, ethically grown food. You know, that's a major part, I think, of conscious consumerism, is then being conscious of your own privileges and what you yourself are able to afford and how ethically that you can shop.
100% agree with that. And people put questions in the forum, otherwise we're just going to keep talking about this. But on that point, it also, I think, an important thing to think about is it comes down to our values, right? And we living, you know, I'm a non-Indigenous Australian born woman. I have immense privilege living on, you know, unceded, stolen land that I benefit from and, you know, try to give back to, but ultimately I will never be able to give back to in the way that I have benefited from. And, you know, acknowledging that I can choose to invest my money, maybe it's not a social enterprise, but in an organization or in a company that supports communities that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. You know, there are so many ways we can choose to make our values align with our purchases. And as Meg said, it's also acknowledging, you know, when I was a student, there was a limit to what I could afford. Now that I'm employed, you know, I'm in a not-for-profit, so there's still a limit to what I can afford, but I can choose to go to the local grocer rather than to go to Coles to get my veggies, you know, and that is something that I constantly do. It's about looking at your values and acknowledging that your purchasing power changes with your life. And often we just get caught in this routine where we don't stop to think about it. We don't stop to think that we're buying our vegetables at Coles, even though we really shouldn't, because most of the time they're, you know, not ethically sourced or they're over packaged, etc. It's, you know, even as small as if you are buying your things at Coles, being that annoying person, which when I was at uni, I constantly was, using the mushroom paper bags to put in all my things so I didn't use the plastic. And I'd constantly get yelled at and I'd just go, sorry, you know, and I got yelled at because I didn't go to the self-serve checkouts because I believe someone should be employed to do that job. There are so many ways in this capitalist system that we get pressured into going down one way that we forget we actually have a choice. We're agent beings, that every time we use our money, we are making a choice by saying what we value. And personally, no matter where I'm shopping, I value the connection of a human being rather than a beeping checkout. And that's something that means you have to line up longer, you know, but you generally have a fun conversation. And you're also telling that organization that I don't want to be using a machine. I want you to employ someone, because unemployment is rising in this country. I hate the takeaway that they say, you know, it means people can get better jobs. Working at Coles isn't a bad job if it means you can support your family and you're getting a wage. You know, we need to be critical about these capitalist systems and how they're changing and how they're forcing us down these narrow paths. And when we don't actually stop to pause and think, is this aligning with my values? We're not being conscious consumers. So just want to highlight with that of course it is a question of privilege when we're talking about ethical consumption and conscious consumption. But of course, we all have a position of power in using our money to acknowledge when we have to use a service or whether we're just using that service because we've never thought about where our money could be spent in other ways.
Definitely. No, I resonate deeply with everything that you just said, Jacinta. And we just had a comment in the forums that it's sad that many middle-class families also miss all the social services as they're not qualified as vulnerable, but many single women who earn bread for their children are not able to get any support. And that's something we also have to consider in this as well. Thank you so much, Helen. Helen, did you want to say, I just saw you put your camera on. Did you want to say something?
Yes, I mean, look, it's great to see so many services and so many opportunities for, you know, the First Nation people or the refugees or for the migrants, you know. But there is also so many women, they are in the society and they are in the middle class and they are single, or they being the victim of domestic violence, or they being disadvantaged. And there is so less limited services available for them and their children because they're not deemed as vulnerable. And that is said, that is always overseen, you know, that group. I find it really hard for them to get any services available, you know. They've been taxed high and they cannot get any support, you know, in any senses. They get always overseen because they have a earning point. But I mean, life is expensive, and especially if they are the breadwinner for the families, it's hard.
Absolutely. I'm curious, when you say services, are you talking about government services, or are you talking about the support like of social enterprise?
Even social enterprise services, you know, many of the services that is available, they are always targeting really vulnerable groups. And yeah, like in instance, for example, if any woman who was a victim of domestic violence and is coming from the, you know, like migrant families, and they've been in Australia maybe like, let's say 8 years. I've seen many women, they've been 10 years in Australia, couldn't speak any English, but they wouldn't be qualified for those, you know, social enterprises or services that is available.
I think look, it'd be a very different conversation to talk about government services, and that'd be a whole nother panel for things. But I think talking about like it, and I think Camila started talking about this when she was on, I think it was Sadiqa that asked about whether the social outfit saw itself expanding to survivors of domestic violence. And you can see from her response that I'm sure if it was she had the capacity in her choice, she'd say absolutely, like of course it's an issue we want to support, of course it's an issue. But I think also what was coming from Camila, from the experience of the social outfit, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Camila, but just drawing from what she shared with us before, but social enterprises like the social outfit and others are very limited in funding. I think that was something that she kept reiterating, is that you can see the vision and drive and leadership that they have for it, but ultimately that funding is very limiting. Even for us at like Voices of Influence Australia, we have a fantastic team that has that drive and ambition, and if we had $1 million, like it'd be amazing what we could do with that $1 million. But unfortunately, Australia is very much a capitalist society. We only really value economic input, economic value, rather than the impacts that we see in our social and political realm of things. Yeah,
unfortunately, I agree with you. I think we can only wish, you know, one day we could change this, and we could have much more, you know, aware society with many social workers, and we can maybe change that culture.
Absolutely. I think that hope is, we have to keep fostering and nurturing that hope, talent. I think without that, then I think we'll all feel a little bit disillusioned and jaded very quickly. But I think hopefully one of the lessons that's come through from this panel is just like the momentum and the potential of social enterprises to, I mean, I'm not trying to minimize it when I say this, but kill two birds with one stone. And that there can be a thing as ethical consumerism, and it can have an impact in our social well-being and economic well-being and political well-being. Jacinta, I want to pass over to you.
Can I add to your point before we go up? I think the other important thing is, as we all know, it's about representation, right? And unfortunately, we live in this vortex in Australia where our leaders still don't acknowledge that we have a pandemic of violence against women. That is not new. It has been in this country, you know, since colonization, and it continues. And yet it is a pandemic that our leaders continually lack leadership on, and they like to pretend that women aren't vulnerable in this country, that the pandemic didn't lead to a huge rise in violence, that dying from the hands of a partner or former partner isn't the biggest killer of young young to middle-aged women. And until, I think, Tulin, until our leadership in this country, and until we as a collective demand that leadership in this country acknowledge that women, girls and women, are vulnerable people, there won't be more investment in services. And I think it's important to remember as well, and I say this with complete respect, that it's a fallacy that there are so many services for First Nations people. There are so many services and community organizations run by First Nations people doing amazing things that are not funded. And the services available to First Nations people, the services that are funded, are government services that are culturally unsafe, that are filled with white fellas who think they know better, who operate from a paternalistic understanding. And when I say paternalistic understanding, I mean they think problems in First Nations community are led by culture, rather than understanding that problems can only be solved and community can only be healed through culture. So I just want to raise that as an important point for us all to remember, that when we're advocating that there needs to be more investment in services for women, it cannot be at the detriment to services for other communities who are vulnerable, who do not have representation, and who are also needing more investment in their services. Because I think that's a very important point for us to acknowledge, that as women, and I say this as a white non-Indigenous woman, you know, I should get more access to services, you know, when I was a young person and I was a vulnerable person, but that doesn't mean that I should get more services at the detriment to a First Nations young woman who is more vulnerable in a society that does not respect her culture, does not respect her community, and does not respect her agency as a sovereign First Nations woman.
Thank you, Jacinda. That was great.
Thank you, Tulin. Thank you for the question. It was a wonderful question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also just adding one last thing to what Jacinda just said about political spending, but how that does impact, I think, when we talk about services, as I said before, government services would have to be, for us to really unpack that would be a whole nother panel. But to bring it back to social enterprises, I think political spending definitely influences and impacts like the kind of social enterprises that are targeting these communities. But simply and it's probably for a much more complex reason than what I'm about to suggest, but just simply because social enterprises are this hybrid between a charity or non-for-profit and a business. And so as a social enterprise, so they still have that foundation of a charity. And so they will still be wanting, and I think Camila didn't share this with the social outfit, but I know that there are other social enterprises which rely heavily on government grants, on community grants, to be able to just keep their head above water. As we learned from the social outfit, like just the general cost of running a social enterprise is significantly higher than those that might have had a typical business model. And so political spending, whether in government services, or is definitely going to impact the kind of services that are provided through social enterprises, purely for that, that funding motivation. And I don't say that cynically. I don't, because I recognize, in order to achieve the impact, you need funding. And so I don't say that with any cynicism or criticism of other social enterprises that have chosen to set up these things because of political spending, because it's seen as a public, a priority on the public agenda. But I think that's another way to bring it back to social enterprises, Talon, that we're not going to see. It'll be probably until political spending goes towards more marginalized communities, that will then in turn create more social enterprises. Kelly and Meg, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I wanted to add on the topic of everything, on the topic of specifically violence against women and in funding or designating funding to vulnerable communities. One particular area that I think we often fail to neglect, especially in talking about violence against women, is we neglect conversations around violence against sex workers. And the sex work industry is hugely dominated by women. And around 80% have experienced sexual assault and other forms of violence whilst working. And it's an area that gets left out of conversation, despite the fact that there are states where it is decriminalised and there's states where they're on the path of decriminalisation, and it's recognised as a legitimate, industry, not treated as such. And I think one of the issues around that as well is that when we fail to kind of acknowledge the the contribution of sex workers as well to things like the lingerie industry and the sex industry in the way that we consume it, so particularly around like lingerie brands, is that a lot of like the lingerie brands will like draw off tropes, like sex work tropes, and off tropes of, you know, like a sexy stripper or this sort of thing, and actually profit off tropes and stereotypes that have been set by sex workers, who are also some of the biggest consumers of lingerie brands. And yet lingerie brands are often not standing by sex workers and are often not putting out alternative narratives to support the plight of sex workers. And so I think, like, particularly as women and particularly as consumers of these brands and as people who are absorbing like, you know, really sexualized content in our day to day, and you know, we really also need to think about, like, in that space, which is a space that, like, I just never even thought about until I started going into this work and learning about the contribution of sex workers into like sex industries and fashion sex industries. And just like as a consumer myself, like how many times I probably bought bra or knickers or something like that from a brand that's profiting off sex workers and then not kind of supporting them. So there are brands that you can look up, and it's little things like offering discounts to sex workers who want to buy from those brands, or actually putting out public statements demonstrating their support for the sex industry, or even giving funds to sex worker peer group organisations, and just kind of looking into that space as well, particularly as women who are big consumers of that, and thinking about that subgroup of women who are experiencing extreme sexual violence, extreme exploitation, and operating in extremely unsafe work conditions, and not because it's not recognised as a legitimate business, but because, quite frankly, our leaders and policy decision makers, who are predominantly men, see sex workers as lesser beings and see them as lesser women. So I think the more research you can do into that space, and the more you can tune into the voices of sex workers and learn to destigmatise, the more I think of an advocate you are to all women, and not just the women whose, you know, work choices you identify with.
Brilliant. I think Kelly, you've got a fan in the chat that said, "Great point." I definitely agree. I think when we were preparing for this panel again, Kelly brought this up in that discussion, and it was something that I was definitely a blind spot in my knowledge, and have since then kind of went into a rabbit hole of researching exactly what Kelly just discussed. And I think it's something that, like, when we go back to the idea of ethical consumerism, and now having that education and knowledge, to have that always be mindful of it when we are stepping into those businesses as well. I wanted to pass on to Jacinta. Jacinta mentioned during her introduction that she's currently working on a project or potentially launching a social enterprise herself. But Jacinta, I'd love to pass on to you to kind of share what you've been working on.
Sure, it's very new. One of my very close friends and I actually had the idea in the first lockdown in 2020. And then when the second lockdown hit, we thought, okay, well, we've got to actually do this idea now, because we've got time and we've got resources, and, you know, we didn't have a social life in lockdown like anyone. But I suppose it's a social enterprise, obviously in the sense that it's trying to create a bit of economic independence, trying to give back to community, create community, and most importantly, as Camila said, it's about education. The working title is SO Cycle, which SO stands for the action, and also sustainability, equity, and well-being. And this is something I've spoken to Kelly about, and I haven't yet connected with Meg about. But essentially, it's a simple idea of trying to acknowledge that there is a big stigma around women who bleed, or non-binary people who bleed, or trans women who bleed and menstruate, and acknowledging that there are services available that provide period products to women facing domestic violence, women facing economic hardship, women who don't have access to the economic supports required to get these products on a monthly basis, but also people in situations of homelessness who often don't have access to these kinds of, toilets and sanitary areas that you require to be able to menstruate in a safe and healthy and hygienic way, but acknowledging as well that often when we try and fix a problem in the not-for-profit world, we think about one small problem, which, not to have any criticism of this service, because I think they've done an amazing job, but services like, oh my God, I just had a mental blank, Share the Dignity, who provide these products to women, except what they're actually creating is more landfill. And what we're actually learning is that this is a project, or sorry, this is a process that so many human beings go through on a monthly basis that we should feel shame about, because we can't talk about it. It's something that we get a bag and we hide the fact that we just needed these products. And my friend and I were quite frustrated at this, you know, immense amount, tons and tons a year by each person who menstruates going into landfill and not actually fixing a problem, not destigmatizing this natural bodily occurrence. So we decided to create a bit of a collective of making reusable period pads. I also, in my Out of Voices of Influence life, work with First Nations communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and over there I've been privileged to have conversations with women about how they bleed, and there is a real lack of awareness of products. Obviously, you know, previous to colonization, people would bleed openly, or it would be women's business, but since colonization, it's once again got this shame and this stigma about being a woman that leads women to create quite unhygienic and quite damaging solutions in the long term of their lives. So the idea of the project was about educating young people and educating older women specifically about the stigma involved and how we can break this stigma and how we can contribute to a more sustainable solution by creating period products. That's actually how I got connected with the Social Outfit, because they very generously donated some of their scrap materials to create this project. And the real framing of it is about going into schools and harnessing the power of people who A, want to do good, and B, who do these sewing groups, which a lot of older women and older community members do. So it's about using these groups that are already established, already are creating community, and asking them to donate one of their sewing classes a month to actually create these products that then we connect with not-for-profits, First Nations run women's organizations, and also Indigenous organizations overseas, to be able to provide these products and hopefully educate women, empower them to have their products and not need to, you know, have a replicable service where every month people who bleed need to access these services that then go and create more landfill and ultimately end us up in a worse situation than when we were before. But the important thing that I really want to highlight about this, because we're at the stage at the moment where we're planning, we're growing, we're creating our social media, but most importantly, we have been researching. And I think that's something that often in the not-for-profit mindset people forget about, because they realize that there's a problem and they have all of the energy and the passion and the motivation to create a solution, which is so amazing. But if we don't stop for a month, 2 months, 3 months to actually engage with the community members we're trying to assist, to actually have the conversations with the organizations that are dealing on the front line with these issues, then we're not creating a very sustainable mindset. So, you know, the last few months, and certainly it'll be happening for the next month as well, we won't be in a position to actually launch the idea of this collective sewing group, although we have the product and we've got the sourcing of materials. We're still in that stage of connecting with many organizations locally and asking them, you know, the important questions of, do you currently provide these products to women or people accessing your service? If so, what products are you providing? If so, how much does that cost you on a monthly basis? And if so, you know, do you think these people engaging with your service would be willing to use a sustainable alternative? Would they be willing to have the conversation? And often we're finding that not only do they think it's an amazing idea, but it's an opportunity to educate through skills of creating sewing workshops. So, you know, not just connecting with these older women's sewing groups who are going to do the products for us, but connecting with them too on a bi-monthly basis, connect at a homeless women's organization, which there are a lot, unfortunately, in Sydney, because homelessness is growing and investment in those social services to bridge that gap and provide safe accommodation in the short to medium term hasn't been invested in, and hasn't been invested in this city for years, which is a whole other conversation we could have. But, you know, it is about connecting the dots in more way than one, and taking your idea just from the idea of there's a need and we want to fill it, to actually stopping and allowing those other voices to come into the conversation and listening to what they need, or what would allow these women, non-binary and trans women, to engage with these services. So we've heard that what they would need is multiple, because, you know, they're not going to have access to wash them and dry them on a regular basis. We took that on board. What we also heard is what they will need is a safe sewing, a bag, like a wash bag, so that if they're in a situation where they're in a hostel or they're on the street, that they maybe don't have as much shame in washing and air drying. So we've taken that on board. And currently the model that we're looking at as well is where we want to make the biggest impact is with young people. I don't know how many of you went to high school here in Australia, but often we do like DET subjects, and sewing is a subject that pretty much every young person has to do for at least one term of their life. When I was in school, we did sewing and we made a pillow, which is great. Everyone needs pillows. And one thing I found as an adult is pillows are very expensive, which one of those things of adulting that I never anticipated. But certainly it's an opportunity for us to actually be having these conversations, not just with women, but with boys. And certainly it's an age for girls to understand that this is not something to be ashamed of. This is something that allows life to continue, that empowers us as, adult women, and that enables these conversations to flow. And we are certain that we don't want these conversations to only be happening with older women, to only be happening with women, but especially to only be happening with women who are already dealing with vulnerability. So that's kind of a little overview. If you're interested, I'm happy to send you more information about it. But I guess the biggest takeaway is there are so many ways we can fix problems. You've got to do the research. You've got to be in conversation with the communities that you're actually trying to meet a need. And you've got to be willing to expand and grow. And certainly what Camila said about starting up an organization with the hope that you could leave in a few years, that's one thing that my close friend Anastasia and I, who are creating it, are really set on. We've got an exit strategy. We've got the strategy that hopefully within a year, within 12 months, we'll be able to have grant funding that can employ a young woman to actually do this, that we're connecting with schools that we already know have these programs established of sewing. We're just giving them a more sustainable way forward. And certainly the school system's open to these ideas. They're just underfunded, and they don't have the time or the energy as educators to be innovative and to create other ways of doing. So when you can actually meet that need and provide it to them on a platter and say, we'll do the work, we'll find grants, or we'll volunteer our time to make it happen. We just need you to allow us to create this conversation with young people. Amazing things can happen.
My goodness, so that's
a lot of info.
If that's just a side project that you've done in this last lockdown, that was a whole pitch. That was fantastic. I am always inspired to hear the things that Jacinta is working on, and just a tireless advocate for communities and justice, which is her position with Voices of Influence too. But I really want to draw upon, there's so much there to talk about, but you spoke about an exit strategy, Jacinta. And I know from the social enterprise perspective, there's been a lot of criticism of social enterprises, and they're going in with an agenda, whether it's youth participation, whether it's what Camila said, having the social outfit be run by a refugee CEO. But I think what social enterprises are criticized for is when you reach that objective, what happens? What happens? And it becomes this rather hypocritical, but this war of power of, I'm not ready to relinquish this. I'm not ready to give this up yet. I've just spent the last 5 years working on this. What do you mean I have to give this up now? And so I think hearing you talk about how in the very beginning stages of it, you already have an exit plan. You have a plan to make yourself obsolete. And I think it's so important when we're talking about empowerment, community empowerment, engaging the communities to really be the ones leading this. That's what the ultimate function of what social enterprises should be doing is you're designing yourself and you're delivering your services to become obsolete, for yourself to become obsolete. I think recently, in Australia, the social enterprise movement is still very much in its infancy. There's still a lot of resistance towards it, but I see the potential of people are recognizing what can we be doing better? What are we doing wrong? Well, not wrong, sorry, but what are we doing that isn't helpful for this movement? And so when it gets to the point of that exit, there won't be that power struggle, and that they will be able to completely relinquish that power back to the community and be self-sufficient.
And on that point, you raised it earlier, and I know that you would have experienced this in starting this incredible Voices of Influence, which is not even a year old yet. It's that grants often exclude social enterprises, A, and B, they often exclude organizations that are under 5 years old. And that stifles creativity, it stifles innovation, and it doesn't allow for the understanding that things change very fast. We no longer live in an environment where we only have not-for-profits that have been established for 15 years that are meeting a need. There are so many more diasporas of communities which require more services, and I think that's a conversation that's not being had, and it's certainly a conversation that needs to be had. If we judge an organization to be only worthwhile investing in when they're safe, when they're secure, when they've been operating for 5 years, we're not providing opportunities for new organizations, ideas, and people to enter markets that haven't been explored yet.
No, it needs to change. It needs to change because, like I said, there are so many, and I bring it back. I always bring it back to young people because that's where I see these changes happening. But yeah, in terms of being really able to mobilize and to move these agendas and to completely. I don't want to use the word capitalize because I think, but screw capitalism, but I will use the word for now, to capitalize on this initiative for social change. But it's tricky. And I think a lot needs to be done to dismantle those barriers in place for participation, not only of young people, but of marginalized communities. And participation doesn't just mean political participation. It means participation, economic participation, and whether that's through a social enterprise or a community initiative. And unfortunately, funding is a massive thing that kind of legitimizes an initiative and allows that impact to be seen. There's so much rich conversation came from this evening. I feel as though I myself have a lot to go back and reflect on this evening. But Meg and Kelly, is there anything, we have about 10 minutes left, is there anything that you think needs to be raised before we wrap up for this evening?
I think I'm going to drop, just because we can, I'm going to drop some social enterprises in the chat if you guys want to check them out, because that's literally all I've been doing these past few days, is checking brands I already know about or organizations I already know about, and then re-understanding and learning more about social enterprises, because as we've been discussing, a really key part is just research and finding ethical brands and finding sustainable organizations. So I'm going to throw some in the chat. You're free to look at them. Most of them are, I've now realized, bra related. I don't know why. I think it's because Kelly was talking about one of the organizations, but yeah, feel free to peruse.
Thank you. No, that's a great idea, Meg. And often I find that even on social enterprises, on the social media, they seem to be supporting and sharing other posts of other social enterprises. So it's like a gateway. Once you're following and involved with one community, it's easier to find others. Kelly, is there any last comments you want to make before we wrap up for this evening?
No, I don't think so. I think we've all contributed so much, and I've learned so much, and this has been such an invigorating conversation. And yeah, I think also the one thing that I would maybe say, on the topic of ethical consumerism around clothing specifically, is getting around markets. Obviously it's been a bit hard with lockdowns and stuff like that, but one of my favorite things is going to markets on the weekends where you've got people selling their old clothes, or I sometimes go and host my own market and go and sell my own clothes. It's a great way to support people in your community, meet other people, recycle clothing, and support a really cool kind of niche, I don't know if you'd call it industry, but a niche kind of community of people swapping and selling clothes. and you can just get so creative with it. I just think it's such a great outlet and it's good for the environment. So I would definitely get around that if you haven't already.
No, definitely.
Love markets. On that point, Kelly, I often do with my friends as well. We have like a yearly swap where like we all bring, because we all shop at op shops and things like that, and we all just like bring our clothes that we're not interested in or that no longer fit, or you know, that we don't have a need for. We all pile it in and we all take turns just to take a piece, and it kind of goes round. So it's also an activity that you can do with your friends, which raises awareness about, you know, how much we overconsume clothes, how little we need to actually continually buy, and it allows the, you know, conversations to flow while also having just, you know, access to a new wardrobe from your friends.
Literally, that's the best thing. I think that's what me and my sister do, but I feel like I need to space this out to my friends as well, because I think it's so good. I won't drop in the because I'm on my phone, I won't drop in the comments all of the lovely sex worker supportive lingerie brands that I found, but what I will do is I will link the name of a Melbourne-based sex worker named Georgie Wolf, who writes on these topics all the time. And I actually spoke with her the other day, and she's just like really awesome, really approachable, and is just really committed to education in this space. So I would put her name in the chat so everybody can go look up. But yeah, that's me done.
The last thing I'll say is also remembering that social enterprises aren't always about consuming products. It's, you know, there's so many amazing social enterprises that are actually cafes or restaurants where their profits go back into community initiatives. And so if you're not someone who, you know, is looking for Christmas gifts or, you know, holiday gifts or birthday gifts, or not someone who really actively spends or doesn't have the financial sustainability to do so, financial means to do so, you know, have a look in your area, depending on where you're based, about, you know, food alternatives to have an experience or to give back to community in those ways.
Thank you for the panelists. Like I said before, there's been so many rich conversations coming out of this evening. I hope it's given everyone a lot to think about and to do your own research, and to educate yourselves about social enterprises, ethical consumerism, and so many other topics that I can't list off the top of my head at the moment that we talked about this evening. I think we might wrap things up there. Thank you again to Jacinta, Kelly, Meg, and Camila, who is no longer with us, but again, for your energy, for your contributions, for your generosity of spirit. It's been a fantastic panel. I hope the rest of you have enjoyed, those attending, and have a fantastic evening. This is the last panel of Voices of Influence Australia for this year, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to connect with every single one of you that have attended. And thank you all of those who have been, we recognize the people that have been very active in the chat and have come to most of them, so it's been a pleasure. We hope that we can continue to do some of these next year, but until then, enjoy the rest of the year, take care of yourselves, and good luck with your work and your social work wherever that might take you.